Hello and welcome, everyone. I'm David Gibson, Director of Fordham's Center on Religion and Culture, and your host for this webinar with our guest, Francisco Cantú, author of the best-selling memoir, The Line Becomes a River, Dispatches from the Border. I wish we were in person to do a book signing and an author signing, but such is the webinar world. Francisco is a Mexican-American raised in the Southwest of the United States. He went on to join the U.S. Border Patrol in 2008 and left 4 years later, beginning a new journey of his own, you might say, culminating in this highly acclaimed 2018 memoir. Francisco is a former Fulbright Fellow and recipient of a 2017 Whiting Award. He's continued to write powerful essays, really terrific stuff in This American Life, Best American Essays, Harper's, and elsewhere. Francisco joins us from Tucson, Arizona, where he says it's actually finally cooling down. And joining us from New York are my Fordham colleagues, Glenn Hendler and Felix Caputo, who will be leading this discussion. Now, Glenn is a professor of English and American Studies here at Fordham, and Felix Caputo is our writer at risk in residence. Their students, who are also taking part live, welcome to the world of the pandemic classroom, they're in a class called Creating Dangerously, Writing from Conflict Zones. They've all read Francisco's book, as many of us have, and these students will take part in the question and answer directly, but I want to remind all of our audience, we have a couple hundred of you online, that you can pose questions in the chat room. Just click the chat button at the bottom of the Zoom box there. In this discussion, I'll summarize your main themes and pass them on to Glenn and Felix as the discussion proceeds. So Glenn, I'm gonna hand it off to you and you take it from here.
Thanks, David, and welcome to everybody. Welcome to this event and welcome to the weird world of Zoom that we're all in these days. One of its great advantages, I think, is that we all have the opportunity to participate in events like this, even from our own homes. And as you can see, that's where I am. And that's where we all are, probably. I'm really not going to do much of an introduction because David already did. Francisco, I believe you've agreed to tell us a little bit about your book and the writing of it and your work in general, and we'll start the discussion after that.
Great, yeah. Good morning, everyone. David, Glenn, thanks for the introductions, and happy to be here. Wish I was there in person. I was really looking forward to this trip. But you know, thus is the year 2020. So yeah, assuming that most of you have read the book, or at least read the back of the book, you know a little bit about my journey. I think maybe what bears repeating, given the fact that a lot of you are in seeking your higher education, sort of, I don't know where everybody is in that trajectory, but, my journey to the Border Patrol began, as an undergraduate in college. And I was somebody who, I grew up in the Southwest. I grew up in Arizona, where I am living now. But, I went to school far from home on the East Coast. I went to school in Washington, D.C. And I was really drawn into public service. I went to a university that really stressed public service. Obviously, Washington D.C. as like sort of the government capital. That's what a lot of people go there for. I was studying international relations, and I began to focus on U.S.-Mexico border issues as a way to sort of turn my gaze back towards where I was from. I think I felt a little out of place on the East Coast, and if some of you who aren't from there find yourselves there now, you might feel the same. But you know, I saw the Border Patrol as a way to return back home and to kind of, from a social justice perspective, as a young person, right? I made this decision as I was graduating. I was like 22 years old, and I really, you know, bought into the idea that I could, you know, kind of be a force for good within this agency and work to change things from within. And I think, you know, right now is especially a time when I think we're looking at a lot of our government institutions, um, and feeling that they're not doing what we think they're supposed to do or what they should do. And so, yeah, this could be something that's on your all's mind as well. I feel like that's kind of the journey that's at the center of the book. You know, with retrospect, I feel that a lot of my decision making at that time was kind of naive, or at least like that ambition to believe that I could be a force for good within an agency was a little inflated. And you know, I think as I've come to reflect on that as I get older, you know, I think we are really brought up in this country to sort of believe in that myth of like one person can change everything, right? One person with good intentions can be the key to sort of reshaping an entire system or structure or institution. But you know, for me, this book is really about sort of the fearsome like strength of these institutions to sort of endure and, you know, and to sort of redirect and subvert an individual's desire to do good or to change them. You know, I think the book is really about the normalization of violence that happens obviously within an institution like the Border Patrol, within a lot of, I think, like military and law enforcement type organizations. But I think it's, you know, it also is about the way that can happen on like a societal level on in a much broader way. You know, the book pays a lot of attention to language and rhetoric. And, you know, at the time I was writing this book, it was like, you know, it was still the Obama years. Things, you know, although I was hoping this would be a book that would kind of shine light on some of the stuff that was happening down here. You know, it seems tame in comparison. Yeah, and so I guess, you know, I just want to like introduce those ideas as ideas for us to be thinking about and discussing, to encourage you to ask me questions about that. And you know, to speak a little bit about the work that I'm doing now, since this book has been published. You know, for the last couple years, I've really been focusing on the issue of immigrant detention. Where I live in Arizona, like within an hour of my home, there's sort of like an archipelago of detention centers. Most of these are for-profit facilities that now under the Trump administration are primarily detaining asylum seekers. Not, you know, migrants who have crossed the border without documents, but folks who in most cases have showed up at a port of entry, said, you know, I fear for my life in my home country, I'm here seeking protection. And, you know, under a lot of these rule changes that have been implemented by the new administration, those folks, instead of, you know, as they would have been in the past, being maybe not welcomed, but brought into the country and allowed to live with a sponsor while their case is moving through the courts. Now, most of those folks, if they're not traveling with children, are put directly into a detention center where, you know, they're spending anywhere from 8 months to a year and a half or longer if their case goes into appeal. They're not provided with, you know, free legal representation because immigration law is civil law, not criminal law. So, you know, they're not represented. They're not able to pay bail, bond, or anything like that. And so those are the folks that I've been in conversation with over the last year and a half. Because of the coronavirus, we're not allowed to be on the phone or sorry, we're not allowed to see them in person. So we're only allowed to sort of talk with folks on the phone and correspond with folks via mail. So if you have questions about that, be glad to bring that into the conversation as well.
Thank you so much, and I think that's going to be a great opening for some discussion. I'm gonna try posing one question to start discussion going, and we also have a brief presentation from somebody else, and we'll then be turning to questions that come in from members of the audience, but also from a group of students, which I'll tell you about in a minute. So this is a question, just to start things out, that has a slightly long preface, but it's a very short question. Number of 2 years ago, or just no, it's actually only a year ago. It feels like forever in these times. I and several other faculty members, a few of whom are here on this Zoom, participated in a week-long immersion program on the border through a Jesuit organization called the Kino Border Initiative. I think I told you about this. We served food to migrants. We held a pizza party for some women and children at a shelter. We walked through the desert to get a little bit of a sense of what that experience was like. But we also met with border guards. We also went to an immigration court and saw Operation Streamline in action, and spoke to an immigration judge who was deporting migrants. And one thing the Jesuit workers told us, this is the long preface, one thing the Jesuit workers told us was that we should be trying to humanize everyone we met. And that word humanize was really important to us, to them, and became that to us. Sometimes that was hard if we didn't like what the people were doing, right? But the goal was to humanize. And I'm wondering if how that relates to what you do in your book. It struck me as a book that humanizes all of its characters. And I wonder if that was a real goal you had, to try and represent a lot of different perspectives, or what?
Yeah, that's a good question. And it's one that I kind of continue to grapple with, because I think when we talk about the issue of humanizing folks, like we're not all starting from the same position. Like not everybody is starting from the same starting line, to say things not very eloquently, but and I guess what I mean by that is that, migrants in, especially in, throughout time, right? Migrants and asylum seekers and refugees in this country, have always been subject to xenophobia, to a lot of politicking, and to rhetoric that really situates them as outsiders, as other, and increasingly, right, as criminals or as a threat. And so while I do agree, right, that it is important to humanize everyone, I think that the folks who are wearing uniforms, and have like the full backing of the United States government, they have a badge and a gun, like those are folks that are in a position of power. Those are folks that, they're starting from a very different place, right, than these folks who, are really very vulnerable. And so I think that's important to recognize. I am conscious about thinking about institutions versus individuals, right? So I think that, obviously a lot of the people that I worked with in the Border Patrol are people that I became close with and that I consider friends, and people that I have a lot of love for. But, at the same time, I think that when you put on that uniform, and this is speaking for myself included, right, like you become an agent of the state. And so you're giving away a portion of you're giving away some part of your individual, whatever makes you, nice and a good person and all that thing, in order to, complete in order to accomplish the ends and the goals that this institution has, and that the state has laid out. And so I think like it's important to consider that. I think like we don't want to lose sight of what an institution by design may be doing, because because of this argument that like it is made up of a lot of good people. I think it's still important to look at institutional culture, to hold institutions accountable. And I think that, like a lot of folks who become part of these institutions, they're being drawn into like a very intentionally created culture that, in the case of the Border Patrol, is quite violent, and is also defined by a lot of impunity, right? The Border Patrol agents are operating in very remote areas, away from public view largely. And the station where I work, like, is literally one of the most remote desert stations in the Border Patrol. And so there's not a lot of people holding Border Patrol accountable. And the culture of, that station and that agency, I think, in general, like, encourages that. And so it's important for us to, always be sounding that bell and be asking for more accountability.
I really appreciate the nuance of that answer. So one thing that Francisco has really generously does is ask for the presence of a migrant support organization, as an organization that's supporting or aiding migrants, to be as part of his presentation. So before we go on to other questions, I'd like to introduce Tara Gear, who's director of the local group Sanctuary Neighborhoods, who's just going to talk to us for a couple minutes, give you a break, Francisco, already, and tell us a little bit about the work of her organization.
Hi. So that's the first time I've ever been introduced as a director. I just want to say that the way our organization works is everyone shoulders some part. There's no person that we could do without. And yes, though I am important to this, I could not do it alone. So 4 years ago, the weekend after Trump was elected, I had a potluck in my living room. I sent out an email saying, I don't know what we're supposed to do, but we have to do something. And when we all met with our various mismatched foods, we decided that instead, in the time we would take to complain about the situation, we would do something. So we, at that time, called ourselves Action Potluck. One thing that we believed we wanted to stand up for was the diversity of our neighborhoods. We're in Washington Heights. It's a largely bilingual neighborhood. And when there is a church up there, Holy Rood Iglesia Santa Cruz, that in the summer of 2016 took in a mom who was going to be deported from her 3 American kids. And we were kind of just watching the situation, but there was a lot of press, there was a lot of politicians, there was a lot of nonprofits, and they pretty much disappeared within a matter of weeks. And mostly moms in the neighborhood related to the mom in this church who could not leave, taking care of her kids. How is she going to get the kids to school? How does she get Benadryl when they have allergies? What do the kids eat? Like, people are dropping off food, but sometimes there's 3 meals in 5 days, and then sometimes there's 4 cakes on one. So we just started organizing that, and we didn't leave. And a year later, when families were being separated at the border, the contacts we had made in our community and the organization that we had sort of cobbled together, not knowing what we were doing at all, because of that work that we'd done, we were called by various pastors and lawyers at the border saying, can you help? There's people being dumped out at bus stations. They don't have shoes. They haven't seen their kids in 6 weeks. So that started a next phase where we created volunteer pods around each family, and we tried to train the pods because, frankly, we did not know what we were doing. And also there was a lot of learning that had to happen on the part of the volunteers. So everyone always focuses on what you do and what you help for these people who are coming in. But the volunteers need a lot of help too. And so we organized pods, and we tried to learn from our mistakes, of which we made many, of which I made many. And then those pods stayed with each family, going to ICE visits, getting lawyers, finding schools, having birthday parties. And we've pretty much stuck with that model. I've sort of lost track, but we've probably helped maybe over 60 families. Recently with COVID, we had to switch to a more food-oriented model. I forgot to share my screen. Hold on, I have pictures. I'll be really quick. Okay, so we started calling ourselves sanctuary neighborhoods because we felt like if our country was not going to be a sanctuary and our state was not going to be a sanctuary, then we would make our neighborhood sanctuaries one by one. These are some of the I just wanted to show you pictures of some of the enjoyment we've had with the kids. There's a lot of just meetings in churches with families and WhatsApp groups between volunteers, going to playgrounds. This is a party of volunteers and families in one pod. There's a lot of work being done. Again, this is not just me, this is a huge group of people, but this is a young man whose father got detained, and then we had kids at his age write letters to the judge. I don't know if you can read it, but it's basically telling the judge that the judge should not send his dad away. These are visits to the court when someone gets detained or has to make show up for some kind of appointment before the judge to get bond or whatever. This was a bond hearing. We respond to people, these are police in both cases, or ICE pretending that they're police. This is on the right, showing up in someone's house. This is the shopping we've done. It's a little bit ridiculous. People getting groceries recently. This is Father Fabian from St. Peter's on the right. These are some of the things that the volunteers are lucky enough to get and share with each other. This is our website, www.sanctuaryhood.org, if you want to help, and we can use all the help we can get.
Thanks so much, Tara. Really appreciate it. It's just really nice to know that in my own neighborhood, you're in my neighborhood, that there are people doing such good work. Back to our regular scheduled program. As David mentioned, there's a group of students in a class that Felix Caputo and I are teaching. Felix is Fordham's Writer at Risk in Residence from the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Hi, Felix. And our students chose the conflict zones we were going to deal with this semester, and they took a vote over the summer, and one of those was the US-Mexican border. They're in the international and domestic conflict zones. So we read and had a really lively discussion of your book, Francisco. We've got 6 students lined up to ask questions, and I hope we can fit them all in. They sort of start with a question from the beginning of the book and run through towards the end. If you want to jump to the end, tell me, and we can jump around in the questions a little bit. And I also see some good questions coming in from the chat as well, so we'll try and integrate those. So our Kamal Galati is our first student who's going to ask you a question. You muted, there we go. We can't hear you yet. Try again. I don't know why we can't hear you, Kamal. While we try to get that, shall I jump to the next one? Sorry about that, Kamal. Laura Babiak, would you like to ask a question for Francisco?
Hi, nice to meet you. So in
Hi, Laura.
Hi. A lot of our discussion ended up revolving around how in the book you give us a bit of an idea of the culture within the Border Patrol, with agents in the field behaving crudely and a pretty consistent undercurrent of hypermasculinity, be that through like urinating on discarded items or like throwing underwear onto cacti, like all sorts of stuff. So how would you describe the culture and dynamic of that workplace environment, and how do you think it affected yours and others' ability to not only carry out the job, but how you treated migrants that you met along the way?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and very sharply observed. I think like masculinity, hypermasculinity, toxic masculinity, whatever you want to call it, really is like a huge defining aspect of the culture of the Border Patrol for certain. But I think also like in general, it's common to like a lot of law enforcement institutions, just like it's common to the military in ways that might be more familiar. Um, and you know, I think there's also, and I guess I should say that like that starts right away from like the moment you step off the bus at the training academy, right? It is structured like a boot camp. You know, you have your instructors yelling at you like drill sergeants, and so it's a very sort of militaristic training regimen. You know, the idea is simply to sort of break down some of the notions you might have about yourself as an individual and rebuild you as part of this this core of people. And yeah, I think like one thing that's so dangerous about that masculinity, I think, is that like a lot of it can be performative. And I think you see folks who I saw folks who, in moments of like engaging with them as individuals, if you're just like stuck in a car with somebody for hours and you're talking about your job, like folks might express like much more nuanced ideas or ideas that are even like counter to the work that they're doing. And then, like as soon as you're in a larger group, you see people like behaving very badly, almost as a way of like telegraphing, that they're on board, that they're part of the gang. And so I think like an institution's culture is I don't think we can overstate the importance of changing the institution's culture. And I think like like last year, a report came out about sort of like the Border Patrol private Facebook chat group, or like message board where Border Patrol agents were posting. And it was like akin to like a QAnon message board or something, full of really vile memes and, like flag waving and putting down people of color and women and stuff like that. And I think, like it's like we're not going to change. The reason that the culture of an institution is so important to think about is that, if we can have like all the good laws and reforms on the books that we want, but like if the culture that mandates that governs what people are doing when there's no one looking over them, when there's no supervisor, or when there's no cameras. Border Patrol agents don't have body cameras. Border Patrol agents don't have, they're not even, they're very rarely on a street corner where somebody with their cell phone can film what they're doing. So like the tools for accountability, even to like hold them to standards that might have been set in the books, like it's always going to revert back to the institutional culture and to the culture that exists like among like the small groups. And yeah, I mean, I think it's hard to imagine how to do that without kind of like completely dismantling the culture of this institution as it exists currently. And I think that, like, although that sounds like a really radical idea, I think it's important to remember that our immigration enforcement institutions have been changed and shuffled around like so many times in the past. You know, the Department of Homeland Security was created after 9/11. So like it's a very young government bureaucracy. You know, ICE used to be INS, so like obviously there's some continuity in that culture. But you know, it's been completely reframed. The work that they do has been completely repositioned, expanded, contracted in many different under many different administrations. And so I think, you know, we often think of our institutions as like inevitable and like this kind of culture that flows from that as inevitable, but it really isn't. And it actually like they continue to grow and foster from us having that idea of inevitability. And so I think right now is a really interesting juncture because a lot of people are being more vocal, and you know, kind of getting off the sidelines about rethinking some of our law enforcement, criminal justice structures and institutions. And you know, I think what's really important is to make sure that immigration enforcement is part of that conversation, right? When we talk about mass incarceration, when we talk about police violence, you know, like the immigration enforcement is part of that. Oftentimes, you know, exhibiting even worse symptoms of what we're talking about in a lot of these local police forces and state police forces and prisons and jails. And so I think it's really important to like keep that conversation, keep immigration as part of that conversation, and to not let it be like siloed into a separate thing, right? Like immigration enforcement is not separate from the problems of our, you know, regular law enforcement that we're talking about right now more openly.
You just half answered a whole string of questions that were coming in through the chat. So maybe you could expand a little bit on what you see as possible. I guess two parts of this. One, what you see as possible changes in border police enforcement and police. You could talk about police enforcement in general, but also what an individual can do about that, because there's a number of people who are really picking up on your individual institution discussion and still thinking about themselves as individuals who live within corrupt institutions and what they can do from there.
Yeah, I'll start with that question. I mean, I think that's why it was so wonderful to hear from Tara, because I think, you know, a lot of times, like the most important thing that we can do as an individual, you know, is get involved locally and get involved in our community. I think like very often we regard these issues as, and I mean, for me in Arizona, like this issue feels very close, but I think for a lot of people, you know, we've had like a presidential debate and a vice presidential debate, for example, and I understand that there's a Supreme Court nomination and a pandemic and all these other things, but immigration has not come up in either one of those debates, which is stunning. And I think that, you know, it's very easy, the media is complicit in this, but it is very easy if you don't live in a border state to feel like this is a remote, far off issue. But, you know, I think like we are seeing more and more and more that it's not, right? Like it reaches into our communities, like our neighborhoods, as Tara talked about. And, you know, every state in the nation has these prison facilities that are contracted by ICE to detain migrants. And you know, if you think about it in a very real sense, like those detention centers become places into which the border of the United States extends, right? The enforcement complex, the deportation industrial complex, as some people like to call it, you know, is moved into your backyard through the existence of those detention centers and through the existence of ICE raids and things like that. And so I think, you know, recognizing that this is not an issue that's abstract or distant. And then, you know, thinking about like what you're good at, right? You know, are you an artist? Are you good with, you know, like business and money management? You know, organizations kind of neighborhood community groups. They need treasurers, they need people to make signs, they need people to design web content. Like, so, you know, even like the minutia of what you are good at, if it doesn't feel like it's related to community organizing or to showing up in the streets, or something like that, there are outlets for whatever you do. And I think, you know, when you make that individual connection in your neighborhood, in your community, with, you know, the migrant, the refugee, the asylum seeker, whose life is subject to these systems and these institutions, you know, through a personal relationship, you're going to learn more and become, you know, much more profoundly, I think, like, involved than you would, you know, just kind of donating money or like clicking that link or sharing that meme online. And then what was the first part of that question? Sort of about like the more policy side of things.
I've forgotten. Oh, just about, yeah, what policy, what kinds of changes if you could go into a little more detail about what you want to change. I mean, the proposals out there for law enforcement range from reform to defund to abolish.
Yeah.
That abolish border patrol is probably a fairly radical statement, right? But, you know, where are you? Where?
Yeah, I mean, I think that question can be a tricky one, and I think there's interesting dynamics behind those kinds of questions. I think often, as you know, like writers or community organizers or activists, you know, we get asked that question like, oh, well, like, what should we replace it with? Like, what do you want to do? And it's like, you know, I'm not a policymaker. I'm a writer and a teacher, and so, you know, for a long time, I'm like, God, like, what would I do? Like, after I've seen the, you know, the immensity and the complexity of this institution, like, how do you go about changing something like that? And I think it can like stop us in our tracks. It can paralyze us, right? And I think those questions are actually sort of like designed to do that, right? They're designed to remind us of the inevitability of the existing structures, and to sort of like a deer in the headlights, just like pause in front of that immensity and do nothing, or to like redirect our attention towards like some incremental change or some incremental reform. Not that incremental change and incremental reform can't be a good thing on the whole, but you know, I think like as individuals removed from these government institutions, you know, what's important is to like the power that we do have, right, is we are the conversation. Like, we're the ones who get to dictate the conversation that's happening. We don't get to dictate it, but we get to influence it, right? And so I think like right now we're seeing the importance of influencing the media narrative by, you know, kind of like not just reverting back into the same kind of like tried and true, you know, decades of, oh, okay, oh, like people are getting killed in the streets by cops. Oh, okay, we're going to ban chokeholds and put body cameras on police officers. Well, that's been tried again and again, and what it means is what we're seeing right now, right? Like people's bad behavior gets captured on film, and so we know more about what's happening, but and you know, that's been significant, but it's not changing people's actions. It's not changing that culture that I talked about earlier. And so I think, you know, what's important is like, if we're the ones that get to influence the conversation, and we're the ones who are influencing like what our elected representatives are showing up at that negotiating table with, like what is their starting position, well, then I think like we should be advocating for the starting position that most aligns with our beliefs, even if it sounds radical. You know, like if more and more people are saying, you know, dismantle the existing border enforcement structures, and you know, like we won't settle for anything less. Like we're not going to get that. But if our representatives are, you know, are showing up already with like, oh, okay, like let's maybe detain less people, or let's make the conditions inside the detention centers less horrifying, you know, that's not a good starting place, because the folks who are over here who are dictating, you know, like they're gonna draw you into the compromise, and you know, very little will change. And so I think, you know, if you start from the position of like, we need to not detain anybody, and you know, these are internment camps. Like, why are we detaining people, you know, who are abiding by the law and showing up as dictated, you know, to ask for asylum and protection? And so, you know, if that's the starting place for negotiations, like, we're going to get much further. And so I think, like, yeah, I think it's okay for us to make a big ask.
Great, thanks. That's a great account of the value of radical rhetoric. I think our next student to ask a question was going to be Ryan Green. Can you appear for us? Thank you. Hi, Ryan.
Hi. I wanted to ask, I was wondering about if you could speak a little bit more about your time as border guard and how it influenced your own identity. So specifically, how your time in the field did or did not change the relation you felt to your upbringing and identity, and how it developed or degraded like your sense of self, I guess. And like further, did you feel connected to the border crossers, or did this work make you feel even more removed from their situation?
Thanks so much. That's a really wonderful question. Yeah, you know, that I think sometimes that, obviously, you know, like, that work feels more and more distant and more remote. You know, as time goes on, but I will be reminded of that work a lot of times when I'm like driving on these lonely stretches of the highway between, you know, like one border town and another, or when, you know, like, go out camping in the desert or hiking in the desert or something like that. And, you know, something that was interesting about that time in the Border Patrol is that, you know, honestly, it was a time in which I was spending like more time outdoors in the landscape, like on the border, than at any other time in my life. And so, you know, even though I was an agent of the state and I was interfacing with all of these, you know, militaristic structures, you know, there was a lot of moments of just like being alone out in the landscape and kind of like feeling and sensing the immensity of the landscape, and kind of like, you know, tapping into some of the stuff that, you know, my mom, who, you know, plays like a big role in the book as like a Park Service employee and a nature lover, you know, always like brought me up to like really appreciate and tap into. And so in that way, like, there, in a weird way, there were moments where I felt like more tapped into those parts of my identity and my upbringing. But I think, like, you know, in retrospect, you recognize that like you were always out there on the terms dictated by the institution, right? And you were always out there to sort of like observe and interdict and stop folks, or, you know, like, you were always a presence from which people were fleeing and risking their lives deeper into the desert. And so, you know, like, now when I'm back out in the desert, it has become like impossible. It's become impossible for me to like look at the landscape in the same way. You know, I think that sort of Park Service idea of, you know, like, you go to the landscape to find inspiration and solace and solitude and stuff like that. It's hard to tap into that when you look out at, you know, if you're within like 80 miles of the border and you're looking out at the desert, even though it might be beautiful, you know, I'm always conscious of the fact that like lives have been lost in every corner of this desert, and that through policy, people have been redirected to take these dangerous trips to the desert, and the desert has been made hostile by these policies, and so it's, you know, it's something that like weaponizes this landscape that I love, and that, you know, like, a lot of these people who are, you know, they're indigenous people, you know, from central Mexico or from further south, or they might even be from northern Mexico, like they might even be from this desert region, and, you know, like this landscape that they're much more in tune with than you know, our dominant culture will have us be. yeah, that landscape is been weaponized against them. And so I think, yeah, I guess that question about landscape is what emerges in response to your question as one of the dominant things. Like it's kind of that time is always present with me in how I look at my surroundings here.
Thanks, that's great. That actually, Komal, who was the first person who tried to ask a question, the technology didn't work there, wanted to ask something both about the Park Service and your mother's role in it from the prologue. Because you said in it, you asked her how she felt about it, and she answered that she didn't know yet. And Kamal wanted to know if you'd gotten an answer yet that you could share with us to the question you asked your mother, what she thought.
Yeah, I think my mom feels, I mean, like there's a spectrum of government service. Like the Forest Service and the Park Service are definitely, on an opposite side of that spectrum than like the Border Patrol. But so I think, my mother feels grateful for all the ways that she has been able to, in her career, and she's retired now, been able to like have a job that like centers her being out in the landscape. And she was an interpretive ranger, so she's kind of that person who, if you show up in a national park, would show up in the uniform and like tell you a story about the landscape or the geology to kind of like make it less abstract and come to life and stuff like that. So my mom's also a storyteller, which is obviously where I'm able to tap into some of that. But I think that my mom has also always been like very conscious of the individual being stymied by a bureaucracy, and these bureaucracies of the government becoming like large and unwieldy sort of bastardizations of like the thing that they're initially sort of supposed to uphold or protect, in this place, the landscape. And so I think, like we should be suspicious of or I guess like we should be cautious of like the ways that institutions and structures will sometimes distance us from the very thing that might draw us into them. And I guess like my mom, I think maybe she has a little more clarity now about that. I think like the Park Service does not have an uncomplicated legacy. A lot of our national parks and public lands, obviously, the Park Service has been quite, heavy-handed in the way that it displaces Native folks from those lands, and displaces their practices and obscures the ways that those folks would had been living on the land for centuries and been in relationship with the land. And like those narratives are important, right? Because those narratives are what we inherit and how we come to think and look at a place. And so my partner and I, one of our friends is actually a Park Service ranger in Yosemite, and so it's the conversation that we have with her a lot. She's very interested in she's a person of color, and she's a Japanese American, and just outside of Yosemite, there were Japanese internment camps, and there's a national monument north of where I live, where there was like a massive massacre of Apache, and that doesn't show up on any of the interpretive signs or in any of the interpretive brochures. And so I hope this isn't getting too far from the question, but I think like those are the kinds of things that my mother's of an older generation, and like I think one that wasn't always grappling with those narratives front and center. And I think now with like the Black Lives Matter movement and some of the conversations that we're having about race in this country, I think those conversations are popping up again. For that generation, like not that they've ever gone anywhere, but I think that like I've had conversations with my mother that, you know, I don't think would have been happening unless this national conversation had shifted in the way that it has.
Thanks. So another student, Camden Thorngate, has a question for you.
Hi. So I'm curious, you kind of touched on this a little, but if after having reflected on your experience in the Border Patrol, you believe it is possible to change a corrupt system from within, does it depend on the system itself, or is this approach just inherently flawed? And then just to push that a little bit further, are people who have become stuck working within unjust institutions personally responsible for the faults of it? And then do they have an obligation to remove themselves from it as you did?
Good question. You know, in response to the first part of your question, I would say that I really believe that like the most powerful and the most direct way that an institution will undergo change is from, you know, just like if we look at history, is from like pressure from the outside. I think like institutions rarely reform themselves out of goodwill from, you know, internal pressure. And, you know, like to the extent that that change and reform does happen, it's almost always in response to like outside pressure. And it's in response not just to like friendly pressure, but to like outrage, right? And I think a lot of times that gets sanitized when we look back at history. You know, oh, like this was a nonviolent movement and this and that, and it's like, well, there were a lot, you know, there was a lot of outrage, a lot of people, you know, in the streets, and that, you know, and it wasn't always peaceful, right? Like people are brutalized and thrown in jail, and people, you know, like put their lives and their bodies on the line for change. And I think that you know, that is what shifts conversations and what puts that magnitude of pressure that will like actually change something. And it's slow too, right? And I think like right now, especially with social media, like our attention spans are attuned to like bite-sized chunks. And, you know, like I think our administration uses that to its advantage by like, you know, here's something else to distract you from the last outrage. Here's another outrageous thing to distract you from this other ongoing thing. And so I guess what I would say is that like sustained outrage, you know, like sometimes I almost think that like we have to set like reminders in our phone to like remind us next month and the month after that to like not forget about this conversation that we were really riled up about a month ago. You know, to call into our city council meeting, you know, to do like those little things to kind of keep that pressure and that outrage sustained. And then the second part of your question was about the individuals who are like in the Border Patrol and the extent to which like how folks should hold themselves accountable. Yeah, that's tough too, because I think, you know, like the Border Patrol has you know, recruited for decades from border areas and from, you know, like Latinx communities. And so the Border Patrol has I think like just over half of the Border Patrol is made up of Latinx agents, right? And so part of the ways that I think like those folks are enticed is, you know, in a lot of these border communities, there's not a lot of like rosy economic prospects. I think like if you look around at your neighbors in some of these smaller communities and you see like, you know, who's able to buy a house, who's able to have like, you know, support their family and has like a nice car in the driveway. It's like, well, a lot of times those folks are in the military, they're working for law enforcement, or something more nefarious, right? But you know, the Border Patrol and these, you know, government institutions, they have great benefits. They have good retirement plans. You know, you can work for like 25 years and retire and have like a good retirement. So, you know, like it's built to be enticing. And so like, yeah, I think you recognize that you are asking somebody a lot, even if they're not like even if they're becoming less and less convinced that that their work is good work, you know, if somebody has kids and a family and a mortgage, can you really expect them to step away from that? And so I think it's also about like building, you know, different kinds of opportunities for folks, right? Like building, like it is so damn hard, excuse my French, to find a steady job with like health benefits in this country, right? Like myself as a writer, like I'm teaching right now part-time at university, just enough to get health benefits, but like this is a situation that so many of my friends are in, right? Like they're service workers, they don't have health insurance, or you know, they have like their parents' health insurance, you know, all these things. So like you know, like this, it seems like it's part of another conversation, but it's really not. And you know, like if we had a society where there were other equitable jobs, you know, like a lot of times I think that folks who are drawn to law enforcement, they want to feel like they're serving in some way. They want to feel like they're part of like, you know, a core, a team of people. You know, and what are the kind of other jobs other than like military and law enforcement that offer that? There's not a lot, right? There's like there's firefighters and there's like EMT workers and stuff like that. A lot of times those jobs are less regular, less well paid. So, you know, like making those jobs attractive and also, you know, like encouraging folks to realize, you know, I think people are meant to feel that if they leave this job, they'll be like, they'll be belly up. And I think like showing folks that, you know, like you can leave law enforcement and do something like firefighting, or, you know, like if we're reimagining these institutions, for example, with like all these mental health calls that police get sent on, you know, if mental health workers, you know, we're given better, you know, more robust support from our local governments and more robust, you know, health plans and pay and benefits, then, you know, you could peel off the officers who are like, well, you know, I don't necessarily like, yeah, I like being involved in the community. I don't necessarily love carrying around a gun. And okay, cool. Like, let's peel you off and put you over here, you know. So I think like starting to separate some of those things that get tangled up and lumped in with law enforcement unnecessarily in this country. In other countries, they would not be part of law enforcement's job. So I think that is another step, right? But it's a long road.
Thanks, Cantú, for your question and for that great answer. We jumping out of the student questions to Tara Gear from Sanctuary Neighborhoods wanted to jump in with a question for you.
I have a question,
cool.
which is a lot of times it feels like the roles that everyone can play are really fixed, and everyone's trying to be part of a story that's pre-written. Like there's a perfect asylum-seeking mom with 3 cute kids who comes, and then this like volunteer sweeps in and helps them, and then they love each other, and so on and so forth. And there's like these fixed stories that don't see any of us as kind of problematic or difficult, or, you know, any of us on all sides. And I find the stories really rigid, and you've kind of moved in a fluid way in your writing and in your life through some of these roles. And I was wondering if you could talk about that.
Oh, that's such a good question. I think like when we look at stories, you know, the immigrant is often burdened with like I'm forgetting the exact term that folks use, but right, like the idea of the exceptional immigrant, like the model migrant. And you know, the media and a lot of storytellers are kind of complicit in this, right? Like we hold up the model migrant as like, well, this person really deserves to not be in jail, or something like that. And I think like who does deserve to be in jail, right? Like who, like what migrant, you know, even if they're, you know, okay, they had a DUI or something like that. Like, does that mean that person like deserves to be, you know, like locked up and criminalized by our immigration system or something like that. So I think like, you know, we have to move beyond those rigid models of like the, you know, of exceptionalism, right? And, you know, like this is something we see all the time in really stark terms with like the police, like the police killings that, you know, a lot of us are paying more attention to, is like as soon as someone loses their life, on the other side, there is this narrative that starts to happen that was like, oh, well, that person was on drugs. Or like, oh, you know, like that person's boyfriend was a criminal, you know, like, so they were in the wrong place at the wrong time. And the fact is like, no, that it doesn't mean you deserve to die, right? So like we need to completely rethink these conversations. Like death and incarceration are not acceptable. And like, you know, walking through, risking your life for 10 days through the desert, like that is not an acceptable sort of like consequence for not being the model migrant, right? Or for having for just grappling with all the challenges that anyone does, you know, that any of us do. And I think, you know, like, I'm glad that you sort of mentioned that fluidity, moving through some of those things with a little bit more fluidity. I think that's something that like growing up along the border, close to the border, and, you know, kind of like with a you know, weird and mixed identity, I think like that teaches you, right? Like the border is a place of fluidity. The border is a place of movement, and where, you know, like stories and narratives are also shifting and moving too. Like there's, you know, there is a lot of imposed rigidity here, but that rigidity breaks down really quick if, you know, if you're attentive, and if you care to sustain your focus in one area, you know, for very long. And so I think like that's something that we could all learn from, you know, reading the narratives of folks who come from the border, folks who pass through the border, folks who, you know, have, you know, different identities than we do, different like, yeah, I just think that like holding simultaneity in our mind is like always going to benefit us. It's always going to bring more nuance to the way that we see and do things. Yeah, because I think, you know, again, speaking about institutions, like they thrive on making, you know, a black and white kind of fixed, you know, fixing a narrative that they can kind of like stake people on one side or the other. And yeah, I just think it's so important. And, you know, this is happening, but I think like the danger is that, you know, with social media that we then become like isolated inside of a cell that like sees things in this one way or in that one way. And, you know, like social media can be sort of insidious in that way where it can kind of like sometimes recognize where we're moving and then capture us and keep us there without allowing us to like move through that space into another space, and to come back and leave and come back. And so I think, yeah, like we just have to be hyper conscious of that. And that's where, you know, just like the joy of being, you know, in academia and being like a voracious reader, you know, all of those things, like they help bring us, you know, whenever I'm like reading a book, I just feel different than when I'm like reading an Instagram post or like on the endless scroll, even if there's good content in there. You know, like when we sit down and engage in that way, I think it's using different part of our brain.
Thanks. We have about 7 minutes before we start to wind down, and I've got like 4 questions I want to try and fit in. So we'll see if we can do that, but maybe
I'll
not.
try to give shorter answers. Yeah, I go on a lot.
We'll try. A student, Elizabeth Hall, had a question for you.
Hi. So I really enjoyed the parts of the memoir in which you described the dreams you had. They were so descriptive and symbolic, and I felt that they really communicated the tie between your experiences at the border and their psychological effects. So to this extent, how have you handled these personal impacts, and do the things you've seen still haunt you today?
Yeah, that's we haven't touched on that, but I think like it's really important to all the things that we're talking about. I think our subconscious is often this thing that we ignore. I think like in our dominant culture, we're not really made to be super in tune with our dreams or super in tune with stuff that goes on in the depths of our soul and our mind and stuff like that. And so I think like for me, those dreams were included because it became apparent to me, that a lot of this grappling that I wasn't doing in my waking life with like the kind of work that I was doing, it was happening in my subconscious, right? And my subconscious was calling me to attention with these really, intense and stirring images and dreams. And so I think it's important to pay attention to our interior life, and we ignore it at our peril. And I think that also connects to some of the talking that I've done already about like landscape too, like tapping into some of these things that are like outside of the career ladder, resume building, sort of capital seeking mindset that we're encouraged to always be in by the society, are like really important for the health of our soul. And so, the more that we can create space for those things in our life, and the more that we can kind of like drop into consciousness that, that encompasses our relationships, our interior life, the outdoor world, I think like it's just better for us as people. Thanks for that question.
Thanks. So I think Felix Caputo wanted to ask a question that might relate to that one. Is that right, Felix?
Yes, thank you so much. We enjoyed reading your book, Francisco. And then I had a question somehow, which Elizabeth also has asked, but that will be a continuation. Was the writing of that book a healing process for you? How far did it bring you to in that healing process? Or did it lead you to discover the worst that the human being can do to another human being, or the worst that a human being can do to another? But before you answer, I would like you also to give a short comment on what we see behind you from where you're talking. We can see maps that makes us think about the watching room into the book, and then the scholars that make me think about Mexico. Thank you.
Thanks so much for that question. Yeah, I love maps, and so the walls of my office are just full of them. I think that's a really there's a really astute observation in that question. I mean, the book did, for me, like the book started. I mean, I didn't join the Border Patrol planning to write a book about it. I didn't join the Border Patrol thinking that I would necessarily have a career there. I imagined that like I would, move on to policymaking or to become an immigration lawyer or something like that. But the writing really came out of that time as, like I kept a journal during that time, and that journal became a place where like I think I very quickly realized that if I didn't write down some of these things that I was seeing and participating in, that like if I didn't write them down, they would just disappear. Like they would be replaced by something else the next day. And so I realized that it was really hard to like hang on to these memories and these instances and these scenes and these conversations. And so, the journal wasn't so much a place where I was doing a lot of reflecting or interior work. I was just kind of like, it's just kind of like bullet points of like, a scene or a conversation, but like not very dissimilar from what, you read in the first third of that book. And, I think I realized after I left the Border Patrol, I would also try to write down some of those dreams because I realized that there was something significant in them, but I couldn't, fully make sense of it at the time. And when I left the Border Patrol, I started to revisit those journals and to revisit some of those scenes and to kind of like just transfer them out of the journal into like a Word document. And I was struck by like the accumulation of all of them because I had never really sat down to read them, but you know, I was struck by like, it was kind of overwhelming to like read 6, 7, 8 pages of these scenes one after another. And so I guess I started to realize some of the things that were happening you know, in my interior space. And so, you know, writing grew from there. I realized that like, if I didn't write about it, I was just gonna sort of like bottle it up and put it on the shelf to be dealt with later, or to like continue having those dreams. And so the writing was cathartic. Like it did begin as a way for me, I think, of trying to make sense of. I guess I wasn't thinking about healing, but I do think that that's what it became. And you know, like the story of Jose and what happens to him, you know, that was another moment where a lot of these things were coming back. That was years later, but like a lot of these things came back because I recognized that what he was going through was what, you know, any one of the people that I could have encountered in the field would have gone through, right? Like I never saw what happened to them once they left the, you know, like my car in the temporary holding facility at the Border Patrol station. I never went into those courtrooms. I never went into those detention centers. I never was spending time with, you know, the wife and kids of somebody who was, you know, stuck in that process. And, you know, these are all things that are like intentionally sort of hidden from us. And so, yeah, I think writing is a really powerful tool for just kind of like record keeping, and healing can flow from that. But like if we don't have the record, like we often don't have the place to start.
That really closely relates to another question I want to pull from one of our colleagues, Jackie Reich. She writes, I'm gonna read it because it starts with compliments. You're an incredible writer. The way you evoke the landscape, the people, and the historical situation is really compelling. Could you spend a bit of time, I guess we'd say a bit more time, talking about the process of writing the book?
Yeah, I think what I've just said kind of, I think, encapsulates sort of like the formulation of like early drafts of that book, thinking about the accumulation of these experiences, what they sort of reveal. I wanted to create a book where there wasn't like a lot of editorializing happening, but that you felt like you were sort of just being placed in these moments and these scenes. You know, that were being remembered shortly thereafter with sort of like a limited interiority, so that like the reader would feel like they were inhabiting that journal, right, in the same way that I was like almost shocked by it, even though a lot of those things had happened to me. And then, you know, like in subsequent stages of drafting, you know, it became apparent that, and with the help of writing mentors and editors, you know, it became important it became apparent that like a lot of folks wouldn't have the context for understanding some of these dynamics of like, how did the border come to exist? Like what kinds of things are governing people's movement across the border? What kinds of push and pull factors exist on either side? And so that's where, you know, like I already had this sort of fragmented structure that jumped from one memory to the next. And so it became easy to sort of like insert little deviations into history and research and, you know, like snippets from newspaper articles and from books. And yeah, I guess like in keeping with that, letting people inhabit that information and sort of like build the vision for themselves. You know, likewise, I felt like there wasn't a whole lot of editorializing that needed to happen in those sections either. And so I guess, you know, the idea was to build sort of a tapestry that like people can kind of, you know, recognizing that people were going to be bringing different visions to this book in different positions. but one that like encourages them to build their own ideas and judgments from the text, and then I think if folks have the paperback, like the version of the book that was finished, that was like published in 2018, was finished before really like right when the election had finished, like before Trump was even inaugurated. The book was kind of like sent to the editor. And so, I realized that like the moment that I had been writing from under Obama, and like the vision that I had of like shining lights on some of these things, like I think Obama made people comfortable. And so we felt like he was saying the right things about immigration, and even if like the reform and all that stuff was kind of, there was roadblocks and a lot of that wasn't happening. And so I think, I also realized that like the book was a very different document in the Trump era. And that the moment was very different. And then I did feel that there was some editorializing and some context, and an argument that all of a sudden felt like it was missing. And so that, during that first year that the book was published, I started working on a author's note that spoke more directly to, what had changed under the Trump administration, and the national discourse and how it had shifted. And so, yeah, it was lovely to have a place to do that with the author's note. And I guess that kind of walks you through the whole thinking behind that.
I know we're running late, but I'm hoping we can fit in one more question from a student. It's about the epilogue. So
sure.
Kelly, can you ask your question?
Hi. So my question was about the epilogue. And basically, I was drawn to the quote that is from the Mexican man that you meet who crossed at the Rio Grande. And he says, "Here the law comes from the people." I was wondering if that was an intentional parallel to kind of this big American ideal about the law being derived from the desires of the people. And then do you think that America in today's age could achieve the kind of dynamic that's shown in the epilogue, kind of as a whole, of this sort of strong sense of unity at the border?
That's really interesting that you pulled out that quote. I hadn't thought about it directly, but been reading a lot of I'm reading a book by Rebecca Solnit right now that's called A Paradise Built in Hell, and it's about how people respond to disasters and the kind of like community organizing that often arises in moments of disaster. So it's an interesting book to be reading right now during the pandemic. And I think like for anybody who spent time in Mexico or moved back and forth across the border, one thing that you really notice in these border communities is that like the omnipresence of the state, like the police, the structures of the government, they're much more distant. And so I think like folks are society is much more community based, especially like rural society. And so like, when that person says, "Here the law comes from the people," I think that he means that in like a really non-metaphorical way, right? Like the folks in that community are sort of policing their own community, and sort of taking care of one another in a lot of ways. I think like one thing that's been talked about a lot since the pandemic has happened is what what is called like mutual aid, and like networks of mutual aid that have emerged as soon as like a lot of people started to have to isolate at home, and as soon as it became like dangerous for old folks to leave their homes and go get groceries, like a lot of neighborhoods and communities, in the same way that Tara was talking about with sanctuary neighborhoods, where like people band together to sort of support one another, to support the people in their community. And I think like, that is a much more like organic and sort of like altruistic way of relating to one another, and sort of like providing for your neighbor. And I think that's like an impulse that a lot of times society distances us from. And again, to return to the idea of social media, like we are hyper connected, but in a way that often like isolates us from like what's immediately outside our door. And so I think, like this is a really interesting juncture socially, because I think more people are hopefully tapping into some of those communities, and supporting one another, and realizing like the extent to which we can help and provide for one another in our communities, and then the extent to like what do we want to ask from our government, what sort of stability and safety net do we expect from them, and then what are the things that we don't want the government to be doing? Where do we think that they're overreaching, and especially with law enforcement, right? Like and the ways in which law enforcement and the law and the state reaches into certain neighborhoods but not others, into certain communities and not others. And so I think, yeah, it's something that's really lovely to see. And as you mentioned from that book, like it's something that I think we really learn when we travel beyond our borders. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I think we've gone about a good deal after our time that we were allotted. So let me hand things back to David Gibson, and thank you, Francisco. It's been really a pleasure.
Yeah, thank you all so much for your questions and attention. And sorry we didn't get to answer them all.
Thanks so much to the students, especially.
Yeah, I thank you. Thank you, Francisco. Thank you, Glenn, Felix. All your students were terrific. Our online audience, really great discussion. Again, thanks above all to Francisco Cantú for being with us. This wonderful book, The Line Becomes a River, Dispatches from the Border. Thank you also for pointing to our local immigrant action group, Sanctuary Neighborhoods, Tara Greer. You can find them at www.sanctuaryhood.org. And I love the comment you made in your about seeing people as our neighbor in your last remark there. This is our second event at Fordham CRC this week. And our first event on Wednesday was about Pope Francis's recent, just new encyclical, Fratelli Tutti, or brothers and sisters all. And a really powerful encyclical. But, there was a comment that one immigrant activist made in a discussion on that. It really hit me. It said really what this idea of solidarity means is that we don't necessarily see people as the immigrant as immigrant or the refugee as refugee, but we start to see them as our neighbor. And that stuck with me, and it really has been echoing in my head during this discussion, that you're writing these conversations are about a topic, but they allow us to see people as real people, and hopefully we see each other as more real and as neighbors. So again, Francisco Cantú, thank you so much for joining us, for spending all of this time with us. I'm David Gibson at Fordham University and the Center on Religion and Culture. Please check out our website. We've got a number of other events coming up this fall. I hope you'll join us. Thanks very much.